Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the first in a series from the American Society of Adaptation Professionals and today's webinar program titled Climate Adaptation, State of Practice in U.S. Communities. Today's webinar is taking place as part of ASAP's ongoing Projects and Evaluations Affinity Group meetings, which convene monthly to discuss member efforts and interests related to climate change adaptation projects and evaluation approaches. We hope that you enjoyed today's session, and if you'd like to continue engaging with peers and colleagues across the climate adaptation community, you'll consider joining us by visiting ASAP's website and signing up to become an ASAP member. As we said, this webinar is the first in a series that will take place throughout 2017 and will continue highlighting documented and ongoing efforts from the 17 case studies featured in the ABT Association report, Climate Adaptation, State of Practice in U.S. Communities. Just a couple housekeeping pieces before we get started. All lines are currently muted, and they will remain muted throughout the webinar program. We welcome and encourage questions, though, and comments to be submitted via our chat function, which you can find is located in the lower right portion of the GoToMeeting webinar toolbar. We will have time for questions following each speaker's presentation, and we'll also have an opportunity for cross-study discussion following our last presenter. If you experience any technical difficulties during the course of the webinar, you can also submit questions or requests for assistance directly to Audrey Seaman. And she'll be popping up there we go, you should see a note from her now in the chat box. So feel free to reach out to her either using the chat function or via email. Without further ado, let me introduce our esteemed panel today. Our presenters are Dr. Jason Vogel from Apt Associates. Dr. Vogel has worked extensively on climate change adaptation issues as a consultant with Apt Associates and previously with Stratus Consulting for the past 9 years. Dr. Vogel was the project manager and lead author who provided technical direction to a team of researchers working on today's featured report. Our next speaker will be Corey Downs. Corey is a conservation specialist in the Economic Development Department and Office of Sustainability at the City of Chula Vista, California. And he'll be presenting for us on the Cool Roof Ordinance and Shade Tree Policy at the city. Following Corey, we'll be hearing from Graham Brannon. Graham is the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Environmental Trust located in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And then we'll hear from Matt Millar. And Matt is the Operations Specialist for the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project at the City of Flagstaff, and he will be addressing for us the Watershed Protection Program. Finally, I'm Beth Gibbons. I'm the Managing Director of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, and I'll be your host for today's program. So with that, we're going to get started, and I'm going to make the first technological leap and hand presentation controls over to Dr. Vogel.
All right. Are you seeing the right screen? Might be a quick question. All right, perfect.
Yeah, looks good.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jason Vogel, and I'm here to talk to you today about this research project that my colleagues and I conducted over the course of about 2.5 years on community-based climate adaptation. And the final product of that effort is a report that we just released in November. And at the very end of this presentation, I'll pop up the website where you can download the full report or just the case studies or just the executive summary if you'd like. Our purpose in conducting this project was really to get an on-the-ground sense of the state of the practice of community-based adaptation to climate change. And really, in a sense, what we were trying to do was benchmark a moment in time to really see what's going on in the year, well, let's say 2015. What does adaptation look like from a community perspective? And we did that very consciously because we wanted to help empower community-based champions of adaptation to really move the ball forward in their own community. And that's why there's such a focus on the case studies and the work that we did here. So briefly, these are the 5 things we're going to cover today. Just telling you what we did, a very brief summary of the full range of case studies that we did, and then most of my time will be spent here on numbers 3 and 4, talking about our conclusions and tactical recommendations. And then, assuming that I don't use up all of my time, there's a quick, I think, Q&A just for clarifying questions before we move on to the full discussion after everyone has a chance to speak. So what we did, this research effort was intended to be both, in-depth and really a case-based critical assessment of community-based adaptation. There's a lot of questions out there that I'm sure you've all heard before. Questions about how we define success in adaptation, what's actually being accomplished out there, what are the barriers to action, and there's actually a substantial literature of people who have thought deeply about these issues and explored them. But our intention wasn't to go and read that literature. Our intention was to go in depth in 17 communities and see how they did what they did, and to try and understand the why and how of them getting to implementation. So this pyramid here is meant to represent kind of what we did, both methodologically but also sort of the philosophy behind our approach. So first at the bottom here, our empirical foundation, we started out quickly with a state of the practice literature review, really just looking at works that sort of self-described as looking at the state of the practice. So the National Climate Assessment, the National Research Council did a report on adaptation a couple of years ago, and the work of a number of colleagues who have tried to look broadly across communities through surveys or have tried to really get a sense of the state of adaptation. We then supplemented that with 50 thought leader interviews. We spoke with 50 people who are really well respected in a variety of fields. So we weren't just talking about climate adaptation. We reached out to folks in natural hazards management, insurance, social justice, planning and community development. We really wanted to understand the perspectives of people from different professional standpoints on what it meant to do climate adaptation. And then those 17 case studies I've been talking about, and that's really the backbone of the work that we did, is those 17 case studies. We then move up a level here in our methodology into the systematic exploratory research effort, and there's a lot of meat here that I could talk about, but I don't want to belabor the point now. I would recommend anybody who's interested in this to go ahead and download the report and get more details, but we did have some expert advisors and an advisory committee of people, again, from a variety of professional standpoints that were trying to keep us honest, and we did develop a lot of methodological protocols because this work wasn't just done by me. This work was done by approximately 15 researchers over the course of this 2.5 years. So we really needed to be very systematic about the way we gathered information in order to make sure that we were drawing conclusions across those 17 cases that were consistent and empirical and not sort of representing researcher bias and whatnot. And then see that little green arrow that appeared there between the two. We really consciously decided not to just set out a methodology and then go and do the work. We wanted to begin the research and let the results of that research come back and inform our methodology, and then we changed our methodology to better get at the questions we were interested in. So over the course of 2 years, our research approach evolved to accomplish the goals of the project. And finally, in that top pyramid, excuse me, on the top of that pyramid is our analysis, where we looked at first cross-case findings, just looking just at the facts across the 17 cases. Where could we find interesting things that propped up in multiple communities, or things that were different in communities that were interesting? So those cross-case findings is an entire chapter, chapter 2 of the report, and then the conclusions and tactical recommendations, which is in chapter 3 of the report, which is really more our judgment as researchers on the totality of the work that we did. And I wanted to emphasize this point here on traceability, where we made a really significant effort to make sure that we were not just opining on what we think about adaptation or the way things should be, nor are we talking about what comes out of the literature of other smart people that have thought about this. Everything that we say can be traced back to that empirical foundation of the report, and and largely to the 17 case studies. So just a reminder here, the red circle there, the vast majority of what I'm going to talk about today is just talking about the tip of this pyramid, but there's a lot more meat to the work that we did, and for that, again, I encourage you to dive into the report. So briefly, you can see that little triangle, I moved it up into the right-hand corner here. I just emphasize, this is the only slide where I'm going to talk about that foundation of the report, but we also have other speakers that are going to speak to the experiences of the community. So briefly, I just wanted to give you a sense of, our primary research, which was really looking at the why and how of specific adaptation actions. How were they implemented across these 17 case study communities? Out of, we picked these 17 communities out of about 110 that were proposed. And it really was a focus on one specific action that was taken so that we could trace it back and understand the social and political dynamics, the policy process that led to actually implementing something that tangibly reduced vulnerability in that community. So that was really our focus. And I just want to draw a couple of pairwise comparisons here to give you a sense of, 17 communities doesn't represent the entirety of the United States, but we tried to be very purposefully diverse in our community selection so that we didn't just have a bunch of liberal, coastal, wealthy towns, but we could actually tell stories coming from different perspectives. So quickly here, Seattle and Tulsa, about as different as you can get from a political perspective. In Tulsa is a red city in a red state. Seattle is a blue city in a blue state. In Tulsa, you'll probably get in hot water if you harp too much about climate change explicitly. In Seattle, you'll probably get in hot water if you don't talk about climate change explicitly. They even produced very different kinds of leaders. Tulsa produced Jim Inhofe, who was mayor for a while as they were doing their work on flood mitigation, and then out of Seattle we had Ron Sims. So very different political context. We wanted to be able to speak to the folks in those blue progressive communities and the folks in red communities as well who still are interested in improving their own quality of life. Avalon and Norfolk are both communities dealing with the same vulnerability of storm surge, sea level rise, but they're taking very different pathways to dealing with it, and they've addressed the issue over a very different time frame. Avalon started its work in the 1960s, Norfolk only in the last 5 years or so. So we can see really very significant differences in that respect as well. Cleveland versus Miami-Dade County, on a socioeconomic level, Miami-Dade County is one of the richest counties in the country. It produces a lot of property tax base that allows you to do some really interesting and creative stuff to really think about how climate change could be addressed. Cleveland is a struggling former Rust Belt powerhouse. I believe the figure is now 1 in 3 people in Cleveland are in poverty. So they don't have a lot of extra resources, and they're struggling to really build that foundational capacity. And then Flagstaff and Mobile County, 2 communities who are really looking, they're sort of marked by their being surrounded or their relationship with natural ecosystems, but in very different ways. Flagstaff's in the middle of a large ponderosa pine forest. They have to deal with issues of fire and potential flooding impacts after fires. In Mobile County, it's more coastal issues, vulnerability to storm surge and sea level rise, and they're looking at things like wetlands and oyster reefs as possible ways to address their vulnerability. So now again, that little triangle, just to remind you that now we've moved all the way up to the tip of the pyramid to just talk about some of the main conclusions that came out of this. And the conclusions of this report were really aimed at adaptation professionals. And by that, I mean people like me, basically, folks that look across many communities on the topic of climate adaptation. When I talk about the tactical recommendations, those were really aimed more at people that are embedded in a single community that are really trying to push the ball forward. So the words that come up here are the actual words of the conclusion in the report. I'm not going to read them to you. I'm just going to speak to them briefly. This conclusion, we appear to be achieving real vulnerability reduction in these communities. In some cases, this can really be confirmed. We've experienced another hazard like the one they were preparing for, and the impact was less, especially regarding extreme events. But we do anticipate that this is true across all of the communities, even though it's difficult to measure in some cases. Second, most of you probably know this and have experienced this, but planning is often done based on current or historic climate data, maybe the most intense extreme event on record, or perhaps the most recent extreme event that's been experienced. But shifting conditions, are going to require us to revisit some of those assumptions. This is especially the case in long-term infrastructure investments, but we're going to have to take that into account. Third, municipal staff and community leaders are already becoming aware of the need for and can make meaningful progress now. And in many of the cases, all of the cases really, the 17 that we looked at, they were already using tools that were available to them, as well as embedding climate considerations into these routine municipal activities that were also, on occasion, trying to do something a little more ambitious, like integrating climate change into their capital improvements planning process. But more often than not, they were getting things done now, kind of doing what they've always done. Second set of conclusions here. Barriers have been addressed at length in the adaptation literature, and we found these barriers are prevalent. They do exist, but in our case studies, we found a variety of ways for overcoming them. And again, that doesn't mean that the barriers don't exist. It's just that these communities found some creative ways to move past it. And so funding is a great example. Probably the #1 barrier mentioned by both people in the communities as well as people that were part of our thought leader interviews. But we saw a variety of solutions come out of these communities, including leveraging existing state and federal funds of different types for development, for forestry, for disaster recovery, but also to the level of self-taxation. A couple of the communities we looked at, including Flagstaff, who we'll hear from today, actually passed a bond measure or a tax measure to generate the revenue themselves to implement vulnerability reduction measures that no one else was going to pay for. And we even see things like the imposition of utility fees, stormwater utility fees, to pay for the maintenance and upkeep of some of these adaptation actions. Fifth, only a few of our cases were engaged in actions that were sort of explicitly titled, quote-unquote, climate change. And generally, those actions were the hardest ones for us to say they had made tangible progress in reducing vulnerability. And that's not that counterintuitive if you really just sort of consider the timeline, where climate change has become an issue much more recently. So let's Chula Vista, again, a community we'll hear from later, their efforts on this really kind of date to 2010. But if you look at Tulsa, another one of the communities that's speaking to us today, their efforts date back to the 1970s and 1980s. They've had multiple decades to try and see results versus just a handful of years to see results. But it does mean that we can't really conclude anything meaningful yet about the ultimate effectiveness of something that is climate change specific versus the relative effectiveness of more incremental efforts that we see in a lot of the other communities in our cases. And sixth, adaptation is a process, not an end state. There may ultimately be no real benchmark for defining success, but what we found across these 70 communities is that using progress towards vulnerability reduction was a really significant and effective benchmark to measure progress. And we think that moving forward, using that as one of, not the exclusive, but one key metric for thinking about progress and adaptation is really going to be useful. This is my favorite conclusion because it has the coolest picture, basically. But we can't really say what a perfectly adapted community would look like. But we did see some really bold and interesting and successful things done across the 17 communities that we looked at. And so we did this little thought experiment where we thought, what if we took some of those bold things that were done across these communities and kind of merged them into this hypothetical single community effort. And you can read, the black text on the outside of the circle here to see the 6 pieces we picked out of our 17 communities. But when we put these together and thought about a single community that did all of these things, we felt like it would be, it would represent a breadth and depth of engagement on climate adaptation that we don't think any community has really approached today, and would be a really useful sort of aspirational target for a community that's thinking like, how can we do things even better? Looking at this hypothetical well-adapted community could really play an important role. So now on to tactical recommendations. As you might recall, I said these are really aimed at our community-based champions. We call community-based champions, these are the people who are working in communities, pushing an adaptation agenda. Sometimes that's a mayor or somebody in a leadership position on city council or a county commission. Sometimes it's city staff. Again, it could be a chief executive, but sometimes operational level staff. But we often found that the people that were really moving things along were mid-level, lower-level staff that were, just lifting the heavy burden, NGOs working in communities, sometimes grassroots activists, or just concerned citizens that really were the ones that were key to getting things implemented in their own communities. And these tactical recommendations are aimed at them. Again, the words are what's in the report. I'm just going to speak to them briefly. Community development is happening. Your community is changing, from day to day, year to year, and climate vulnerability already exists. It's going to get worse. Waiting won't guarantee better information, and we also found that real vulnerability reduction takes time, sometimes decades. So probably the best advice we can provide to anybody, anywhere in the United States, is to just get started. You might as well start now, because for all the reasons I just stated. Second, most people are not motivated by this sort of nerdy concept of vulnerability reduction. It's pretty abstract. In the cases that we looked at that were successful, they really built a critical mass to implement an adaptation action by tapping into other community motivations. And sometimes that was protecting a way of life, or preserving natural habitats, or improving the local economy, generating jobs. But usually it was multiple motivations that came together to really generate that critical mass to get things done. Third, the communities we looked at were using really common policy tools: ordinances, permits, bonds, utility fees, easements, zoning, hazard mitigation plans. These are the kinds of things that we saw people using to push climate adaptation forward. So I think our advice on this front is to keep looking to those tools as something that's effective in pushing an adaptation agenda. Fourth, you really need to have good ideas ready to go when that window of opportunity arises. In many of our case study communities, unfortunately, that window of opportunity came in the form of an extreme event or a natural disaster, a hurricane or a fire or a major flood. But the key was there were people in those communities who, in that moment, were able to think about how to build it back better instead of just building it back the same. This also holds true, however, for sort of the nicer windows of opportunity, where there's like a sudden funding opportunity that's available, and you have an opportunity to try and implement that. Fifth, we really need to be able to respond to changing circumstances. This includes, avoiding irreversible outcomes, keeping our options open, being flexible. A lot of the policies and other actions that we saw didn't have that kind of flexibility. It seems like it's a difficult thing to do, but to the extent that you can build it in, it really can make a big difference. Sixth, in our assessment, the poorest people, those already burdened by pollution or who lack economic opportunity, or people facing disenfranchisement and racism, these people are often the most impacted by climate, variability, climate change, and they're also typically the people who have the least voice, even in local government. They're working 2 jobs. They may not speak English. it really makes sense to be aware of those vulnerabilities and of those populations, and to the extent that you can, to try and bring them into the process to try and make sure that you're protecting your entire community. Our second page here, number 7. Climate change is often experienced through a community's sort of interface with natural systems like forests, rivers, coastlines, or floodplains. And action to restore the natural function of those ecosystems can often be a really cost-effective adaptation. What we're saying here is that we feel like those actions, the sort of natural capital or natural infrastructure actions, really should be considered alongside more conventional policy actions like standard concrete infrastructure or the kinds of socioeconomic interventions that we saw in other communities. On 8 here, outreach and engagement is particularly important when public support is critical. We'll probably hear today from Flagstaff how important it was to get the community to get behind passing a bond initiative so that they could tax themselves to get some of this work done. Sometimes it's less important to build public support when it's sort of a purely administrative activity, people just in a city department or a water utility that are making a small operational change to account for changes in climate. But critically, there's a big difference here between outreach and engagement. Outreach is sort of reaching out and communicating predetermined, potential actions to the community to build support for them. And engagement is much more about co-developing those actions. And by far, doing engagement is a much more time-intensive effort, but it develops, a sense of buy-in by the community that we, across the communities that actually did this that we looked at. It was pretty impressive, and it really helped build a lot of momentum. So it's worth considering whether just doing outreach is enough or if an engagement strategy is really needed. Number 9, adaptation, it's new. It's going to require some experimentation, some innovation, and some risk-taking. And when you do that, some ideas are bound to fail. The lessons from failure can be as important as the lessons you learn from success, but what's important here is that we have to be flexible enough to make adjustments over time as we find out what is working, what's not working, as we pay attention to our peer communities and what they're having success with, and to really just be responsive to that. To me, this seems like it should go without saying, but I don't think it does. Whether you use the words climate change to describe what you're doing is an important decision. The words climate change galvanizes some communities into action and really motivates them. And in others, it's a needless distraction or it gets caught up in politics in a way that doesn't help get things done. Basically, be smart about whether you talk about what you're doing in terms of climate change versus resiliency or just smart development. Any of those excuses could be used to take the exact same adaptation action. Leadership, conventionally, I think people think of leadership as something that comes from, from that proactive mayor or council person or county commissioner, or maybe the head of a department, the head of a water utility. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we saw was the importance of staff-level leadership, especially as these things are implemented over a long period of time. They typically happen over a longer period of time than a single election cycle. So your mayor may be gone, your proactive mayor may be gone, or your council or county commissioner might be term limited. And then staff-level leadership is really how things get done. And it's also how you build up that capacity while you're waiting for that window of opportunity. And again, it's not just staff-level leadership. It's sometimes people in NGOs, community organizations, grassroots activists. We saw a lot of activity going on at those levels that really helped move the ball forward across the 17 communities we studied. And 12th, partnerships can be really important. Working with other like-minded organizations can amplify effectiveness. You can leverage resources, you can share political capital, you can share information, and really just get a lot more done than you can on your own. So I I was trying to cover about 2.5 years worth of work in about 12 minutes. I'm not sure how close I stuck to 12 minutes there, but what you'll see here circled in red is the website where you can download the full report, all of the case studies if you're interested, all 17, or just an executive summary. And there's an awful lot of additional information there that I think if you're really trying to get good work done in a community, or if you're working across communities, there's an awful lot that can be learned from the 17 communities that we looked at. So with that, thank you very much. And Beth, please take control of my computer.
Thank you, Jason. That was really fantastic, and not quite in 12 minutes, but understandably so. Lots of good information there. So we're gonna keep moving on through our presenters in the interest of hoping to preserve some time towards the end here to have a discussion and hear questions from the community. And so with that, I'm going to now call up our next speaker, Corey Downs from the city of Chula Vista. So Corey, you should see the opportunity to become the presenter coming up on your screen right now.
Okay, perfect. I just got unmuted, so hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank
I
you very
can hear
much
you.
for Perfect. Thank you very much for inviting me to come speak about some of the adaptation, and we always tie it very closely with our mitigation work as well, but our general climate action that we are doing here in Chula Vista. So I'll start with just a brief overview of some of the city goals. Some of the city goals that really drive the actions that we're undertaking. We have our climate action plan, which has goals of 20% reduction below 1990. Those have been long-standing goals since one of our early council members attended the Kyoto Protocol signing and adopted similar climate change reduction goals. But then we also have a more consumer-focused home upgrade carbon downgrade program that really looks to bring the benefits back to the residents and have them have lower bills while they're reducing their emissions. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm in the Office of Sustainability, which is in the Economic Development Department, and our mission statement is People, Planet, Prosperity. Sometimes people wonder if the Economic Development Department is the best fit for Office of Sustainability, but I have to say that with our longstanding commitment to reducing bills for businesses and homeowners, there's definitely a lot of connection between the two that we see, and we've really been energized by becoming a part of the Office of Economic Development. Some of the achievements that we've received from taking these actions, we received the 2014 Climate Leadership Award, and I always like to highlight awards because they're a great way to build support from elected officials. City leaders love receiving the awards, and it's a really great way to showcase what you're doing and also let other cities know what you're doing. And our mayor recently was at the Paris COP negotiations last year. So to dig into some of the climate action work that we're currently underdoing, a little bit of a history is it started in 2000 with our initial adoption of a CO2 reduction plan. Then that was updated with our stakeholder-led process in 2008 and again in 2011. So we've had lots of iterations, and we're also currently in the process of updating it again. So there's lots of work that we're currently doing there. Okay, so as I mentioned, the stakeholder process was really key for our more recent adaptation or more recent iterations of our climate action plan. It was called the Climate Change Working Group, and it brought together stakeholders from various aspects of the city, city facilities, environmental groups, utilities of both water and electricity, developers, a whole wide range of city stakeholders. And really the goal was to reach out to them early and as was mentioned earlier, really engage them in the process because of other past actions we've experienced that had significant implementation delays because of stakeholder comments later in the process. We wanted to bring them in early and really start working with them. So as the slide mentioned, it was an 11-month process for each iteration, so 11 months for the mitigation and 11 months for the adaptation work that we did there. And the reason for that long time frame is a lot of the people that we brought in are not climate or adaptation professionals. So we had to spend a good half of the time, and these were monthly or 3-week meetings or so. Again, they're not professionals, so we had to be conscious of their time commitments. But we spent about the first half of the meetings educating them, bringing them up to speed on the various issues in our community, whether that be the impacts from droughts, heat waves, or wildfires, or any of the other the various ways that climate change can impact us. And then we spent the remainder of the meetings looking at various activities that we can take, oftentimes pulled from case studies like this of other cities that are taking action. So these tools are really valuable to be used in the field. And kind of going through them one by one and seeing which ones the community members think are a good fit for the community, and which ones there's concerns with that we can identify early, and kind of weed out the ones that are going to be hard to implement later on in the process. So one of the actions that I think is really important to highlight is the work that we've done with other nonprofits and other local partners in the area. Two that I'll highlight are the San Diego 2050 is Calling, and as well as a previous report that was put out by a group called the Climate Education Partners. And they're a local organization that looks at local leadership and really focused on how climate change can impact the San Diego region. And so this was really valuable because we didn't have a lot of, or the funds enough to do a full vulnerability assessment, but we were able to use a lot of very high value research that they did for the region for our area as well. So things like increasing heat waves, increasing droughts, as I mentioned, the wildfires, and San Diego County, where Chula Vista is located at, it's a Mediterranean climate, so we don't get a lot of natural rainfall. So things like drought can really impact not only our quality of life, but also our economy down here, as well as wildfires can be very, very visual, they can definitely push the forefront to, or push the issue to the forefront when some of the largest wildfires are happening, especially we had some in 2006 or 7, as we were going through, or shortly before we were going through this process. So a lot of those impacts were very visible there. And then the other is a nonprofit called EPIC that's mentioned there, and they've provided a lot of really great technical assistance for us in doing this. And so, we don't have a lot of, again, we didn't have a lot of consultants for this project or for the adaptation plan. So we really relied on a lot of nonprofits in the region that are able to do some of the more technical technical analysis, and then we can synthesize that for the stakeholders. So the actions that came out of our adaptation plan, we had a total of 11 adaptation measures that span, that had a lot of different impacts. But the ones that I'll be mainly talking about today are our cool roof requirements, or cool roof policy, and shade tree policy. And we were able to implement a cool roof requirement for the end-land climate zones in our city 2 years before that was required by state law. So we see that as a really great tool, but also fitting it with the economic development perspective as well. We see that there's a lot of great opportunities for engaging and making sure that contractors in our city are really cutting edge. As I mentioned, this is now a requirement by the state. So, whether they wanted to install or be familiar with cool roof technology, sooner or later they were going to have to. So we kind of made sure that contractors in our region were ahead of the curve for state policies, and we see that as a really great tool. And if there is some pushback, it's really just pushback at a different time, because the contractors would be having the same questions that they're coming with us now, just a little bit later, so we're able to achieve those early on. We also see some really good benefits from cool roof because it is also a mitigation measure. As you install cool roofs, you minimize the need to do cooling loads, and in San Diego we have a significant portion of that, especially in our inland areas. And so that also is a great measure because it helps us sell the policy in that it's going to help the residents save energy and make their homes more comfortable. But it also helps us leverage different pots of funds that we can use for implementation actions. Because this does help save energy, we're also able to leverage some of the funds that we have from the state for energy efficiency implementation. So that was definitely a really great way to leverage existing resources and build stronger adaptation actions here in our city. For the shade tree policy, we created the policy in 2012 following the adoption of our adaptation plan. And that's been very successful, or we've had good success in implementing that. Another adoption or another element to increase the amount of shade trees in our region was we updated our design manual to require at least 50% of shade coverage for paved areas. So, this is not something where we kind of just did it once and then walked away. We're definitely looking at how to institutionalize a lot of adaptation and climate planning in the various aspects or city operations that we do. So I'll finish up with some final or some next steps that we're looking to do. As I mentioned, this is something that is an ongoing process for us. We're currently updating our mitigation plans, and so cool roof will be a portion of that. But one of the goals is to expand the cool roof requirement from climate zone 10, which is the more inland climate zone or the middle climate zone there, to climate zone 7, which is our coastal climate zone. This has more homes, but because this is also a energy code requirement, we do have to show the calculations that it will be cost effective and not cost our residents anything more than they will save. And so we're currently doing the analysis of that region, but it is a little bit more challenging because there's not as much of the cooling need in that inland area. But we see that there's still opportunities there as well. We're looking to create a shade tree master plan. We, as an outcome, or as not necessarily outcome of the adaptation plan, but just a general growth of the city, we've brought on a city arborist who also manages some open spaces for us. But he's currently working on the shade tree master plan and also implements or ensures implementation of the shade tree policy. And it's a long process, and we're one where we're also looking for funding where available. But there's definitely a lot of good opportunities there. We're hoping that this will be something we can achieve in 2018 or earlier if we find additional funding for that. And finally, we're really looking to increase our project monitoring. So we have overall program monitoring with our greenhouse gas inventories that we do every other year, but we don't have a lot of monitoring for the specific projects that are being put in place. A lot of the funds that we see are more for implementing the projects. So we're currently working with nonprofits in the areas such as EPIC that I mentioned earlier, and other cities that are doing similar implementation efforts and trying to get at the similar efforts. But we definitely envision working closely with utilities to create more robust project monitoring and able to showcase the results that we're able to find to our residents as well as to other communities that are looking to take adaptation actions. This case study, as I said, would be a great tool for us. So we're definitely very excited about it. Thank you. And there's my contact information if anyone has any questions. If there's any other elements or questions, feel free to let me know.
Great. Corey, thank you so much for sharing this work and getting us updated on what's going on in Chula Vista and with this project. We are going to take a trip toward the middle of the country now to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I'm going to be taking control of the screen, so folks should be able to see slides coming up here. And I think that we're going to go through this, Graham, as you help us walk through the slides. Let me know when you're ready to advance, and I'll move them forward on your mark. Oops, but let's get you so we can, there we go. Oops.
Oh,
Okay, Graham, take it
how
away.
about now? Is everything good
How
now?
about it? Yep, sounds
All
good.
right. Well, let's go. Okay.
Okay.
I'll run through this fairly quickly, and what I'll try to do is kind of hit a little bit of the actual report, but then quickly move on to kind of what's been going on lately. Um, my name is Graham Brandon. I'm currently Executive Director of the Metropolitan Environmental Trust. People call it the MET around here. We focus on recycling, holistic environmental work, and outreach. So my job's changed a little bit over the past a little bit over a year. I worked for the city of Tulsa in intergovernmental relations and working with some stormwater quality as well as the sanitary sewer side and some infrastructure and education kind of areas. But I've been involved with what was called Tulsa Partners for a number of years now, which is now called the Disaster Resilience Network, and I'm the chair of the Disaster Resilient Housing Council at the moment. I've lived in Tulsa almost my whole life. I had a few respites in Colorado, Texas, and Wyoming, but I'm back here to stay. And so I'll just give you an update on kind of mainly on what's been going on, but let's go ahead and hit the next slide and talk about a little bit about Tulsa's history. It's a pretty colorful history. If anybody remembers back in the 70s and early 80s, you can see some pictures there. We were extremely famous, and it wasn't always proud moments when we got on the news, I have to say. But we were at one point, we had, let's see, 15 in a 15-year period. We're in the 70s and 80s, most federal disaster declarations in the nation, and the 1984 Memorial Day flood is something that anybody my age or anywhere close to my age remembers, will never forget it, and it just is in our DNA now. And of course, younger folks, not so much, so we have some work to do there. But after all those things were occurring, we really had a good coming together of a variety of folks, not just one type of folk, but a variety of people, from citizen activists to elected officials, professional hydrologists, engineers, a lot of different people that wanted to try to work on this, and we really headed towards these repetitive loss areas and try to find solutions and get greenscapes developed that can take some of that overflow. And so it was primarily, it was flooding was our big thing. Some people might know Ann Patton's name. She's retired now, but she's a legend around Tulsa and in other areas too. She lives in Florida at the moment. But we have some other folks that are pretty famous in this area. But anyway, one thing that we did that maybe was a little different than some is our Tulsa regulatory floodplain maps exceeded the FEMA minimum regulations. What we did is we considered the forecast of fully urbanized watershed development right from the start, and extending the regulations watershed wide. So then I think that was important. Then we also got a stormwater utility fee that helped us actually have some money to do something about it. So as was mentioned previously, that climate change and that adaptation, those phrases are not used around here that often, I have to say. Mitigation is a pretty good term, and then as you'll see as I'm talking in the forward, you'll hear resilience too is an acceptable term around here. So anyway, I'd have to say that all this that happened in those years, we really jumped on buying up some of these properties, and then working with a lot of education, and what's resulted is now we have some of the lowest flood insurance rates in the nation through the community rating system, and we're a Class 2 community. And anecdotally, over the last couple of years, there's been some pretty severe flooding in the area of Tulsa, and it's just been so evident that all these areas are flooding and Tulsa's not on the list. So that's pretty exciting. So next slide, please. Okay, you'll see that's just a picture of a group under this Disaster Resilience Network, and you'll see home, business, community, and a picture of a bunch of folks. That was taken pretty recently at our annual meeting, and where we just changed our name from Tulsa Partners, and at that very meeting. But to kind of explain what was going on there, we were developing kind of in the past here a little bit through Project Impact back in the Clinton era. That helped us get going within the city of Tulsa structure itself, and then that led to a lot of partnerships, and then from that Tulsa Partners formed, and Tulsa Partners was one that kind of was a spin-off, and they spun it off outside of the city of Tulsa government, and now we just recently finally dropped the Tulsa name, and now we're called the Disaster Resilience Network, which seems to actually be descriptive of what we do. Next slide, please. One area we really concentrated on, and I alluded to it before, and it's resulted in our low rating with the CRS, is our program for public information. It's been extremely robust and successful for many years, and we contracted through Flanagan and Associates and worked, with our City of Tulsa experts, our employees, and we have a stormwater drainage and hazard mitigation advisory board that keeps everybody on their toes about it, which is real important. And then more recently, we've been working with OU, University of Oklahoma, and their Southern Climate Impact Planning program called SCIP, and we've had some interns there. We had an Oklahoma State University intern also. They were working on key messaging and also doing some surveying of some areas behind the levees, getting to know their level of education, all sorts of demographics, what they know about it, that kind of thing. One benefit from that, we worked with them on these messaging, and we found that I guess I might be age discriminating here because I'm 56, but we found that having some of these younger folks developing some of these and also working with social media, that I think they did a really great job, and we were happy that that they were doing the work, and we were just nodding our head saying, wow, that's really good. So that's kind of something we noticed. We did do some marking of the anniversary of our big flood that we had 30 years before. It was before 2016, and that was an Arkansas River itself flood, and which most of our other flooding was more flash flooding, and the Arkansas River actually was a controlled flood because we have a dam above us, and so we actually marked that, and I think it was real important to get elected officials out there to mark what happened in 1986. What we have, you can go on to the next slide, it talks a little bit about the 86 flood, but what we have is a challenge. Oh boy, let's see, go ahead and go to the next one. That shows kind of the event I alluded to, and my friend didn't put some of these slides in, but anyway, what we have here is what we call disaster amnesia, and so people forget about these things, and so we did mark that event, and we put a high water mark sign up, and then we got pushback from a developer nearby. It's kind of an interesting story. I won't go into the details, but it shows how important that sign is, and so we'll kind of that's a lesson that it is important. But this slide points to kind of the future. Where are we going? And the 100 Resilient Cities through the Rockefeller Foundation was a really big deal for Tulsa to get to be a member of that. we were in the second round. They had 3 different rounds to get up to 100 cities throughout the world, and Tulsa got it on the second round. And our work through all these years, and of course, you know, all the disasters we had in the 70s and 80s actually kind of prepared us to, I think, to be able to be considered. And one of the person there you'll see is Laura Hendricks, who happens to be now, she works for the city of Tulsa, and she's our current floodplain administrator. And so she helped write the grant, and we were really focusing on shocks. They use the terms in this shocks and stressors. That might be common language to you, I don't know. But shocks like floods and tornadoes and hurricanes and things like that. And then stressors like failing infrastructure, poverty, discrimination, things like that. And so we got our Chief Resilience Officer, which is part of this program, in 2016, and Mary Kell was an architect who had some floodplain management experience, and she was a city employee. So, and we all knew her real well, and then we have a change of administration, and now a change in the CRO, and this person has a completely different background, and she's Devon Matthews, and her experience mainly is in poverty and racial disparity. And so this is what they've done, is they've given us a little extra time to get our feet back on the ground and under a new CRO and to get going. So you can tell that things are going to change a little. So some of us old fogies under the Disaster Resilience Network had to say, okay, well, let's at least talk to the mayor, the new mayor, and say, hey, remember that we do have shocks in Tulsa and not just stressors. And so I think he understood that, and will be a part of this whole program. So I think that was really important. Next slide, please. Okay, this shows about our Tulsa area long-term recovery committees that we've had fairly recently. We had a pretty calm time in Tulsa for a number of years, and you wouldn't, if you lived in the Oklahoma City area, you would have a completely different story, especially Moore. Pretty much everybody's heard about Moore. Moore has just had a horrible time over the last 15, 20 years, and we've really not. And part of it's been our planning as far as the flooding, but as far as the tornado, that's, you know, it doesn't have much of anything to do with us, our planning. It has to do with us being lucky, I guess you'd say. But we're between Oklahoma City and Joplin, and you know what happened in Joplin too. So, but more recently, we've had some small tornadoes in our area, one impacting a primarily African-American community and on one part of town, and about 300 homes. And so these were small tornadoes, and I think we've responded pretty well. But we have these long-term recovery committees that are still active, making sure that you know, we get these folks, every one of them, back to a good quality of life, that nobody's forgotten in the long term, and I think that's really important. So, what you have to remember, that disaster amnesia, it's challenging to motivate people to get the planning done and do all the things that you need to be doing before disaster if nothing's happened for a long time. So maybe, I hate to say it, but maybe we have a little more motivation today, and luckily nothing really, really catastrophic has happened over the last few years. So next slide, please. As far as some other work that we're doing, you'll see my picture there. That's at my house. The rain barrel I have, that was a work of art. I paid some money. It was a charity, and so it's really kind of neat. But anyway, you'll see some other things there too. But low impact development, we've been pushing that, and then trying to set it up. The problem is, a lot of times your zoning and all those kind of things aren't friendly towards it at all, and so we're doing some rewrites there and starting to be able to give credits and those kind of things. Tulsa was way behind in that, and we still aren't quite there yet, but we have Oklahoma State University is helping us develop a LID criteria manual that will be helpful and know where we can have some engineering and actual measurement type things and specs that will give the credit that these folks deserve when they put in these things, because we do have a pretty robust fee in lieu of detention setup and those kind of things that they can get some credits for, which will help do what we want to do and also make it a more pleasing community. So we have a program called Partners for a Clean Environment, and we just added a LID, low impact development aspect to it, so you can get your cling, so you can do it personally or through your business. So I have a cling on my window at my house because I'm somewhat of a nerd. But anyway, that's a little bit to do with challenging, getting green infrastructure going around the Tulsa area. Go ahead, next slide. So I talked about this. Tulsa Partners moved on to a new name, and we are working outside of Tulsa also. And so what we did is we formed this disaster resilience network, and under it, like Tulsa Partners kind of had, we have different programs. The first one you see there is the Disaster Resilient Business Council, and it is mainly for small businesses and nonprofits to develop the plans that they need to develop so they're prepared. Most are not, and we're trying to help that. Our niche is mainly these, not the super large companies and those kind of things. Our niche, and also not the super wealthy area of town. Our niche is the underserved. So this would be considered in the business world the underserved, and an area obviously that could use a lot of help. So we're working under that one program for Disaster Resilient Business Council. Now the next slide, what do you got for the next slide here? Okay, I've missed a slide perhaps. Could you have missed before the Business Council, Disaster Resilient Housing? There we go. Good. That's I didn't want to miss that one. Okay, great. That one, the Disaster Resilient Housing Council, it's really exciting what's been going on just very, very recently, and we are working on being more resilient with our housing, and especially focusing in areas, making it affordable, that kind of thing. So one thing we've done is we're focusing primarily with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, for their Fortified Home for High Wind and Hail program. A lot of people that are on the coast know a lot more about IBHS and their Fortified program for hurricanes, high winds and hurricanes, but the High Wind and Hail program has just it's not been a big deal around the middle of the country. So we have brought it to Tulsa and the rest of Oklahoma, and with the different levels to cover you up to an EF2 range tornado, and also if you do your Class 4 resistant shingles for hail. And I'm excited about getting ready to build a house myself, and I'm sure not going to do it to the bronze level. I'm going to the gold level, and and of course I'll have a safe room too. But I'm excited about bringing the expertise here, getting the training. A lot of that's through the DRN, and getting the right people here and getting the training, so then these people can build these houses, get them certified, and the folks can hang their hat on it that it's built to that standard. And now we're also having to work with the insurance industry to make sure that the folks get the credit they deserve for this. And that's one place that we're having some challenges, but we're working on it. Okay, so next slide, maybe two slides. Let's see. We're going to get to the Cross-Cultural Council. Yes. Okay. The Cross-Cultural Council is trying to make sure that we are being able to communicate effectively with the various folks that live in our community. And we have a great variety in Tulsa. Believe it or not, you might not think we do, but we surely do. The Hispanic community is the most obvious one, but we have Hmong, Russian, just all sorts of different folks of different languages, and then you also talk about culture and religion and all those kind of things that we're trying to be sensitive to. And one example is in 2013, a Guatemalan family in Oklahoma City drowned because they sought shelter in a storm drain from a tornado, and also another family, they tried to outrun the tornado rather than taking shelter, and that it was a language problem of taking shelter meant going someplace, where to us around here, we think of taking shelter as finding your hidey hole that's in your house. And everybody around here knows, that's lived here forever and speaks English, knows that you have a hidey hole and that's where you go. So so we have work to do there. So we've been developing commercials and getting outreach from a number of different languages to try to make sure to get everyone safe, and then be able to communicate in these different communities, both on the front end before anything happens, and on the back end if anything does happen. So that's kind of our third group that we are working with, and it all comes together, obviously. So next slide. Okay, I'm getting about done here. And this just shows some of the players, and if you need to contact anybody, Ann Patton, as I have at the bottom, she's retired, but we decided she wouldn't mind having an email or two because we know how great a person she is. And but that's our kind of the group, and all of these folks were involved in the interview process that helped create the case study under this report. So I think this is all I got.
Great. Thank you so much, Graham. Really appreciate that, and really appreciate getting to hear that take on how you approach this work through different lenses, depending on where you are. And so we're going to move now to our last case study, and we're going to hear from Matt Millar at the city of Flagstaff. And I'll get this up and running, and then Matt, I will hand over the ability to run the mouse from your side. And Matt, do you have your audio on?
Yep, I'm all ready.
All right, I hear you. Great. Do you want to see if you can get the slides advancing?
Sure, let me try the first one here. Yeah, I think it'll work. It's a little bit of a delay, but I'll go ahead and get started.
Okay.
So just to recap from the case study, the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project is a hazardous fuels reduction project. And it's designed to reduce the risk of high severity fire in two key watersheds that surround Flagstaff. The project is funded by a $10 million city bond that was voted on and approved by the citizens of Flagstaff. And there really are three main financial partners: the City of Flagstaff, Coconino National Forest, and the Arizona Department of Forestry. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to run through some of the context in which gave rise to FWPP, show you the project location really quickly, and then talk about some progress that we've made since the case study, some of the challenges that we face, and some of the lessons that we've been learning along the way.
If you're not able to get the slides to advance, if you want to just give me a clue, I can hit them for you.
Okay. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be going, so go ahead and go to the next slide. So a little bit of the ecological context. The project area, as mentioned before, is in the middle of the largest contiguous ponderosa pine forest in North America. It has a historical fire return interval of about 2 to 10 years, a very frequent fire. and that fire was historically a low to moderate intensity. And that process maintained open park-like and discontinuous forest structures. As you can see in the historic photo of a typical ponderosa pine forest just north of Flagstaff, very open, very park-like. Fast forward to 1992, an overabundance of small diameter trees acting as ladder fuels. And what has happened is we've had, due to past grazing, logging, and fire suppressions, we've had this change in forest structure, which also has altered the historical fire regime from a surface fire more to a high-intensity, severe crown fire, stand replacing fire, which is not what this ecosystem has co-evolved with over time. Next slide, please. A little bit of the social context, which is outlined in detail in the case study, so I won't go into it too much, but just to mention a few things, the foundation for FWPP really sort of was set in the mid-90s, and there are a lot of things that happened in the mid to late 90s that were really important precursors to the project. And really in 2010, we had the Schultz fire, which is a really major turning point. The citizens of Flagstaff became very acutely aware of the risk of high severity fire. And really, if this fire had occurred literally one ridgeline over from where it did, the high severity and post-fire flooding that occurred would have impacted very heavily the most populated areas of Flagstaff. So it was really a near miss, and that really got the wheels turning for this project to get started. That year and the following year, the project was imagined by a group of folks. In 2012, that was brought to the City Council. They approved it. It went on to the bond went on into a local election in which it was passed by 74% of the citizens of Flagstaff, and it approved $10 million of funding for the project. Shortly after that, for the lands managed by the Forest Service within the project footprint, the NEPA planning process began. Next slide, please. So just to run you through the project location, the area that has the dark purple boundary, that's the city limits for Flagstaff. The light purple squares, that's a combination of city and state land that's currently being treated in phase 1 of the project. And then the yellow polygon to the north, Dry Lake Hills area, is Forest Service land that consists of phase 1 and phase 2 of the project. And then the last phase, phase 3, is down to the south. And that's the very headwaters of a watershed on Forest Service land that flows into the Lake Mary Reservoir, which at times supplies up to 50% of the water for Flagstaff. And across the entire project site, there'll be a number of different harvesting methods employed, mostly ground-based logging, but in some of the steeper, more rugged terrain, there'll be some steep slope implementations happening. So next slide. Oh, before we move on, sorry. The total project area on Forest Service land is about 10,500 acres. So the city bond funding the majority of the work outside of the city limits, which is pretty novel. And then the remaining acreage, about 3,000 acres, is made up of a combination of city, state, and Navajo Nation tribal land. So next slide, please. So after the passage of the bond, the approval of the bond in 2012, forest thinning was able to start right away on city and state land. And really, once that bond was approved, the Forest Service was given the green light to begin their NEPA process, so their planning process for the project on their portion of in the project footprint. And at the time of the case study, the final EIS and record of decision had not been finalized. It since has been finalized, and the whole process took about 2.5 years, which if you've worked in the NEPA planning process, that's a really incredibly fast amount of time. So that was a really big success. And the final alternative was actually a blend of alternatives, which moving forward in operations will give the Forest Service a lot more flexibility, so that also was a big achievement. Since the case study, we've engaged very heavily in public outreach in various different ways, field tours, lots of different interviews, public educational events, and that's been incredibly helpful for us, and we're going to continue to do that. As far as progress on the ground, acres treated, I mentioned, or I showed you in the map, phase 1 area, which is the area within the city limits and some areas just north of the city. That All of the project layout for that area has been completed. All the hand thinning units, mechanical thinning units have been identified, and the prescriptions have been written for those. We finished temporary road construction, temporary log roads, and thinning and hand thinning and mechanical thinning has started in the phase 1 area of the project. Phase 2 is about over halfway done. There's still a lot of actually all of phase 2 is on the Forest Service land, so they're currently finishing the layout for that. And as far as acres treated, reducing that risk of hazardous high severity fire on Forest Service land, we've treated about 350 acres, and on city and state land we're getting close to around 2,000 acres. And the reason that Forest Service has treated a little less is because the planning process after the bond was approved takes some time. So it took a little bit of time to get the planning in place, the NEPA process, final EIS, finalized, and they're poised now to begin operations on a large scale beginning this coming spring. Next slide. So some of the challenges that we have run into here, one being slowness of action, and it's not a knock on anyone, but just the reality of the NEPA process and the planning process on the Forest Service, it just takes time. And that can be a little bit of an issue from a public perception perspective. The bond was passed in 2012, and here we are nearing 2017, and only 350 acres have been treated. So for work on the ground from a public perspective, that can be a bit of a challenge. They don't necessarily see the successful planning process as a success like we would. Personnel changes, people that work for the Forest Service and within the city, as they've been a part of this planning and this project, if they leave on a detail or take another position, that leaves a big void. And so there's a steep learning curve to get people that backfill up to speed. A challenge on our side, on the city, is change in the local government. So city council, mayor, that happens frequently. This project is going to unfold over the next 5-8 years into the future still. So as local government officials change, that poses challenges. One thing that's been a very large challenge is because of the level of public engagement, this project doesn't have a dedicated public information officer, and that's been a big challenge because we've all had to juggle different outreach events, and it would have been very helpful if we had one person dedicated to that to kind of come up with a master plan to organize the outreach. And then the biggest challenge, not just for our project but for the surrounding region, is the private industry here. There's really no market for small diameter wood, so that really makes it difficult for our contractors to come in and do the work and remain financially viable. But we're working on that. Next slide, please. And some of the lessons that we've learned so far from this project, the acres treated during the NEPA planning process. So those 2,000 acres that we were able to do right out the gate, that has been really helpful from a public perception perspective. And now as that area has been completed, 2,000 acres pushing that 3,000 acre mark, the Forest Service is now poised to begin pretty large operations next spring. So that timing, that unfolding of events has been really important for this project. Our outreach efforts have paid dividends in keeping public support strong. This is a project by the people for the people, so we want to maintain the highest level of transparency, and we want to educate them as things proceed. And then another lesson, some of the things that have been very, very useful products and sort of innovative approaches have come through collaborations with our non-financial partners. Those entities have been incredibly important for our success. And then the bond funds, they allow for a sort of more of a forest stewardship contract model, so getting away from that traditional timber sale model. So that's been helpful and has fueled some different types of innovations. And then as far as internal structuring, we've learned that having partner working groups, so getting individuals from all agencies to sit down once a month for various meetings, executive meetings, communication meetings, that really keeps the wheels turning smoothly and keeps everyone on the same page as far as what the strategy is moving forward. And then the last is having a bond fund from the city, a principal amount of $10 million. We've been able to use that to leverage other funds, matched grants, and in-kind contributions. So that really has put us in a position to leverage, and we're a little over $3 million of leveraged funds. So that's been very helpful also. Next slide. Yeah, and so that's sort of the quick overview, and hopefully afterwards, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to do my best to answer.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate it. So we have about 10 minutes left in our prescribed time for the webinar today, and I want to give people a chance to be able to ask some questions. And as folks either can put those questions into their the chat window within the GoToWebinar system, or if you want to indicate a raised hand, then we could also call on people directly. But as we kind of move into picking up questions from the attendees, I'm just hoping that folks might be able to address one question I had as we spoke in setting these calls up, and that's really about how you keep this work going through administrative and management changes. And I think that all of us are thinking about administrative changes in a major way across the country, but within your own communities. I know that you've gone through some serious management and administrative changes, and what has been your experience, and what does it take to make sure that programs continue to advance, and how have you kept this work going forward?
This is Graham Brandon. If I can jump in, I would answer that in a couple ways. One, we have great, experienced, respected city experts and employees that luckily they stick around for a while, and that's extremely helpful. Then we've coupled that with some of our private or our nonprofits that have stuck around, like the DRN, and they have garnered enough respect throughout the community over the years that when, say, a new mayor comes on, I think that we'll get the ear. So it's a little too early to tell at the moment, but I would say the combination of our employees at the city coupled with some of our respected nonprofits. Sometimes they listen to people outside of their own government, be it nonprofits and influential folks, a little more. So that's one place to definitely lean on.
Hi, this is Corey from Chula Vista. One thing that I would say has been really successful for us is kind of, as I mentioned in my presentation, the awards or recognition, and a little bit making the program larger than any one staff. We actually went through recently some program changes here, and you know, I took over a little bit larger role in the program, and I was really surprised at how many city leaders or others in the city that I wouldn't necessarily think of very actively involved in the climate action planning process, you know, mentioned, hey, are we going to win this award next year? Or, you know, kind of that they know that there's activities that we've been recognized for in the past and they want to keep receiving that recognition. The other quick or important thing I'll say is, you know, it's never too early to start making sure that you treat your interns and all of the other kind of lower level staff really great, because you never know when they might be running the program one day. So, you know, we always try to do a lot of career advancement or education and cross-training and make sure that there's not one person at our city that has all the information, that it's really spread out and institutionalized throughout our city operations.
Great. Thank you so much for passing those thoughts around, and as we all think about that challenge of administrative and management resilience. A couple questions from folks on the webinar from John Bulldog. This question is really to Jason, but I think anybody could jump in with some responses, and I'm going to paraphrase a bit here, but the question is about the role of doing a rigorous vulnerability assessment to lay the foundation for action. John's question says that the presentation focused on the action stage, but he's wondering what the study found about the role of vulnerability assessments, and that in his community, the work it's been very valuable to do these vulnerability assessments to build community support, engage others, and so he's just wondering if you saw any signs of that across the case studies that you looked at.
Sure, an excellent question. I think I can say across the 17 communities that we looked at, the vulnerability assessment was not a proximate cause for any of the 17 actions that we profiled, which is not to say that it didn't happen in those communities or that it wasn't important in some way, but it didn't directly lead to an implemented action that reduced vulnerability. And that, you have to keep in mind that's sort of the focus of our report, and so that, it could be seen as I guess, a weakness in a sense, that we didn't really ask the question, how are vulnerability assessments useful? But that said, we know that kind of work was done in a number of the communities that we looked at. So Seattle, as an example, Seattle Public Utilities has done a number of scientific assessments of their vulnerability over a long period of time that has built up the capacity within Seattle Public Utilities to really take some very forward-thinking actions. We heard from Chula Vista today, but the San Diego 2050 report, while not a classic vulnerability assessment, was a really important document that informed, played a awareness raising and promotional role to really get the issue on the radar of decision makers. And it was written in such a way that it was very understandable and very easy to comprehend the issues that were being brought up. So rather than like a yes or no, black or white answer, I think it's probably very nuanced, and we might be able to say something like the vulnerability assessment, formal or informal, is something that generally occurs on the kind of at the beginning of a policy process, more in the raising awareness, building up institutional capacity, helping people to understand the issue, and has a lot less of a direct impact on generating policy ideas or getting them implemented.
Great, thanks, Jason. Oh, go ahead.
Do you mind if I just add something to that really quickly?
Oh, certainly, please do.
One thing that helped this is Matt Millar from the FWPP project. One thing that really helped us, which is I think maybe a little bit related to the vulnerability assessment, was we had a cost avoidance study done. So it looked at that big 2010 wildfire that was stand replacing, caused a lot of damage from flooding afterwards. And the cost avoidance study looked at what would a fire just like that look like, and what would the cost be if that happened in our FWPP footprint. And so that added some teeth that was very quantitative, where you could take to city council or the mayor and say, listen, if we have a similar event that has just happened, one ridge line over, these are sort of, the costs that will be associated with that. So by investing $10 million, we're investing now, to offset the cost of disaster later. And that was really, really helpful in this whole project. So.
Great, thank you. So I do want to be respectful of everybody's time, our attendees, but especially our speakers, and I want to thank them again, Jason Vogel, Corey Downs, Graham Brannon, and Matt Millar. I think your insights on these case studies from across the country are incredibly valuable, and I deeply appreciate you taking the time to talk with me leading up to this and talk with the adaptation community on the call today. For folks who are still joining us on the webinar, I just want to remind you that if you enjoyed the presentation today, I hope that you will join us for future events by visiting the ASAP website and becoming a member of ASAP. In order to accommodate the demand for these programs in the future, we will be implementing a member-first policy. So if you want to be able to keep up with the work of ASAP and innovative practice across the field, please make sure to sign up for your memberships. And a recording of the webinar will be available in the coming days. We'll be distributing it to all of the registered attendees, everybody live on the call, and any questions that were not answered that have been posted in our question area. I'll make sure to distribute those out to our speakers, and hopefully we can connect the folks asking with the experts that joined us for the webinar today. So thank you all so much. Happy holidays to everyone, and I look forward to seeing you in 2017.